Welcome to Comics Bazaar, the channel of comics commentary and arcana. This video features the Uncanny X-Men number 303, cover dated August 1993. So the image here of Jubilee weeping and being comforted by Jean Grey, very striking with the white background and the yellow box lighting. And the cover caption, of course, if you read only one X title this month, this issue must be it. I have a vivid memory of seeing this on the shelf in the comic book shop I frequented at the time and being really struck by it. It really stood out and popped in comparison to the titles beside it and around it. So let's open this one up to the splash page, and we've got Jean Grey here looking for Jubilee. And the narrative captions here set everything up, but an interesting little detail is this one, where we get a little potted history of Jean Grey as Marvel Girl and later as a genetic template to the cosmic entity called the Phoenix. So it talks about how Jean is blessed with the ability to reach out and touch another's mind, to share their pain, their joy, their feeling of hopelessness, of happiness. This is not one of those times. So this is not John Romita Jr. on art. Instead, it's a guest penciler, Richard Bennett. And this is quite a striking introduction to his art. This, I think, was the first time I saw his work. Very detailed and a bit of a cross between Jim Lee and Neil Adams, of all people. So an interesting combination. And really what's striking about Richard Bennett is he's got a good command of perspective, and he's not afraid to draw in details in his backgrounds as well. And I like this effect of his, which we'll see a few more times in the issue, of the polished metallic floor reflecting figures in it. So this is a nice little detail here of Jean, her legs reflected in the polish of the metallic floor. So then we turn over to a double page spread with an inset panel. And so she finds Jubilee in Professor X's ready room. There's the Cerebro helmet there. And we've seen this ready room a few times in previous issues of both Uncanny X-Men and Adjectiveless X-Men. And Jubilee here is in a bit of a mood. She says, I know, this area is off limits. All of Professor Xavier's most important information is stored here. If you want some place to sulk, try the danger room. You're not the only person who reads minds, you know, she says to Jean, and Jean says, but not at all, but I'm apparently much better at it than you are. The only reason I'm here is to make sure you're okay after, and she pauses, after everything that happened. So here we go. Jubilee says, if you're waiting for me to wilt and start blubbering, forget it. I don't do that crying thing. And we'll see if that turns out to be the case by the end of the issue. And she says here, but if you want to know what I'm thinking, I can sum it up in 2 words: life stinks. And Jean agrees, yes, sometimes it does. Would you like to talk about it? Why is talking about it going to change anything? So something has happened, and the title of the story is Going Through the Motions. Creative team: Scott Lobdell, writer; Chris Eliopoulos, letterer; Joe Rosas, colorist; and Richard Bennett, special guest artist. Dan Green inks a few pages here. He inks 6 pages, pages 8 and 14 to 18 of the comic book pages, not as the comic book itself is paginated, but the art pages, right, 8 and 14 to 18. So, as I was saying there, I just want to comment again, no scrimping on background detail here, and perfect command of perspective as well from Richard Bennett. It kind of comes out of nowhere, really, as a fully formed artist. So it turns out then that Jubilee in the end does agree to recount her perspective on everything that's happened up to this point. And so she begins to recall and says, it's not like we didn't see it coming a mile away, but it's different when it actually happens, no matter what you do to psych yourself up. So then she's recalling how there's nobody in the X-Mansion, particularly because practically everybody was either still cleaning up in Texas or hanging out in Japan with the Head Twins. That's her comical reference to Psylocke and Revanche. And so see previous issues of both titles for those storylines. And then she's saying the whole mansion was as quiet as a, well, she stops herself from saying a tomb there. It was real quiet. And then we see where the only people were, down in MedLab, down in the infirmary. And so this is all the Shi'ar tech that Professor X has resorted to in order to try and prevent Illyana succumbing to the legacy virus, which he's reluctantly come around to inferring is what is wrong with her. The legacy virus unleashed upon the world as Strife's revenge on mutant kind at the end of the Executioner's Song crossover. So while he's working, this is a nice little detail here, the color hold here of Illyana's head here in this instance. So he's talking with, they're arguing really with Moira MacTaggart and Professor X. Moira is pretty much convinced that there isn't really anything that can be done. The child's genetic deterioration is just inevitable. There's no way of turning it back. But Professor X remains hopeful. He is a hopeful man, hence his dream of peaceful coexistence between Homo superior and Homo sapiens. And he says once the gold team returns from Dallas with Forge, that's why he sent them there in the first place, even though they got caught up in the business with Fitzroy. I'm certain we can, at the very least, find some treatment to arrest the progress of disorder. But Moira, as I said, is skeptical. So then we shift into the room in which Ileana is lying in the Shi'ar tech, and we've got Jubilee playing with her with a Bamf doll, little doll of Nightcrawler, and then Kitty Pryde turned up at the end of the previous issue, 302, and she's bringing some fresh linen for Ileana. And we get from Jubilee's captions that Jubilee's a bit skeptical of Kitty. I mean, Jubilee is in the position now, if she's 13 years old, more or less of what of Kitty was when she first arrived at the X Mansion at the end of the Dark Phoenix saga as the newest neophyte X-Man. And Jubilee thinks, or recalls here in her narrative captions, maybe I could have shown less chewed, but there was something about Kitty Pryde that just totally torqued me off. She hadn't been an X-Man in like a zillion years. Then 5 minutes back in the mansion and she's acting like this is her crib. So some jealousy there. And Jubilee has been spending time with Ileana, but Ileana's delighted to see Jubilee, and they communicate with each other in Russian. Which Jubilee doesn't have that ability. And she says here, this is the part that she doesn't get. Kitty's old, like what, 16, 17? Ileana's barely 7, yet the two of them act like they're the bestest buds in the world. 4 on the floor, front wheel drive, totally aligned. And Jean Grey explains, they go back a long way. There was a time when Ileana was older than she is now, when she and Kitty were closer in age. And so we get Jean using her TK to open up the computer displays and tap into Xavier's archives on all the various teams. And then she shows us these pictures of Ileana as she first appeared. Ileana's first appearance was Giant Size X-Men number 1 from 1975. But it wasn't until issue 145 that we learned her first name. We knew she was Peter Rasputin's little sister, but it was in 145 we learned her name was Illyana. And then we get this little kind of potted history of Illyana's time with the New Mutants in particular here. And there's more on this particular page with Ileana was first brought to the States as the Lunatic Assassin Arcade's hostage. So we get this little potted history of who Ileana was for perhaps readers who weren't familiar with the character, who hadn't appeared in comics for about 3 years since the end of actually a little bit more, like 3 to 4 years since the end of Inferno. So that was the point that Ileana was de-aged back to the age she was before she went into Belasco's demon sorcerer dimension of Limbo. This occurred in Uncanny X-Men 160. Then she joined the New Mutants, I think in issue 14 of New Mutants. And then we're just getting like these images of the time that Illyana and Kitty bonded as, you know, teenagers in the X Mansion, and then reverted back to her original age. So that was at the end of Inferno, and specifically New Mutants number 77. So she hadn't been seen in comics until issue 18 of X-Men rather, when Colossus returns to Siberia to visit his parents, before that whole ordeal with Soul Skinner and the murder of his parents as well. So when I first read this issue in 1993, I had no familiarity with Illyana beyond those issues of Adjectiveless X-Men. I didn't know anything about her history, so I had no real personal connection to the character. And it's an interesting narrative device on Lobdell's part in this issue, where we don't get Illyana's perspective on things. Instead, we get Jubilee's perspective and relation to what happens to Illyana here, which would have been, you know, the perspective of most of the readers at the time, the likes of me, likes of new readers who came on board with X-Men #1, who just didn't have that history with the character. So it's a canny choice of perspective on Lobdell's part. So then Jubilee recalls the previous evening and how she was asking the professor, who was working hard, trying to figure out whether anything could be done for Illyana. She remembers asking him, like, what's the prog doc? How much longer is she going to be hacking and wheezing herself to sleep every night? And Professor X doesn't say anything. It was like he couldn't bring himself to choke out the words, not that he had to. It was all right there on his face. No matter what they did, they weren't going to pull it off because Illyana was dying. There was nothing anyone could do about it. And so she says to him, look, Professor, it's not your fault. She's trying to comfort him. She's got her hand almost on his shoulder. Professor X anguished. I want to make this point about Richard Bennett here. So he's a guest artist. We're not getting John Romita Jr. here. But that Neil Adams element to his style is really great for giving expression to the faces of the characters. You can see, like here in particular, well, I'll work up to this, where she says she felt majorly bummed for Professor X. It's one thing if an X-Man buys it in the slugfest du jour, but she's just a kid, Snow White, like she was just being punished for being a mutant. And he's the father of all mutants. I wanted to, I don't know, hug him, tell him not to blame himself, that everything was going to be okay. But she doesn't. And you can see it in her eyes here, her hesitation, her doubt about what worth it would be to him to say that. And like the emotion playing on her chin here. Really well done by Richard Bennett. And that's the kind of thing, and I don't mean this just to be unfairly critical of someone like Brandon Peterson, but Brandon Peterson just at this point in his career wasn't able to give that level of expression to a face, and I think he would have struggled on an issue like this. So having a guest artist like Bennett who has this ability just was a great choice. For whatever reason, John Romita Jr. couldn't do the issue, maybe because issue 300 was double-sized and he needed a break at this point. And then we continue with the recollection of the evening after she doesn't hug Professor X. She goes into the lab where Illyana's bed is, and she kind of says, look, she's off to bed with nobody else except her. And then Kitty kind of reaches out and says, wait a moment. And she says, what does she say here? She says, Illyana wanted you to know how much she appreciates you looking after her. She was hoping you could stay a while, get to know each other. So Jubilee says, okay, I got a few minutes to spare. And then Kitty starts translating for Illyana. Banff says, thank you for helping him talk. And she gets the translation, and then we get Jubilee's recollection, commentary on it. It was then that I guess maybe I kind of realized that Kitty might not be half the dweeb I always thought she was. Of course, no self-respecting teen I know would call herself Kitty. What was it, an hour or two sitting there on the bed, yakking and whispering, and don't ever tell anybody this because I'll deny it, and giggling. Everything seemed almost for half of a fraction of an instant like that everything was normal. Truth, it was probably the first time since my 12th birthday that I felt less like a mutant and more like a girl. And don't forget as well, Jubilee is an orphan. Her parents are dead, and that's why when we first met her in Uncanny X-Men 244, hanging out and causing trouble in a Los Angeles mall, she was there on her own and living in the mall. And so it's interesting too, because of course Ileana at this point is also an orphan, given that her parents were murdered in Siberia. And she says here she knew it couldn't last. And then we pick up, and I really like this panel here, where we're out on the corridor and we're looking into the med lab room with Jubilee and Illyana and Kitty, and we also see down the corridor to Professor X with a computer audio visual link up with Storm on the Blackbird. And Storm fills him in on the end of the mission in Dallas. Fitzroy's injuries necessitated his release to federal authorities, she says, and Forge's status with the government has dissuaded the authorities from arresting Peter for the assault. So Colossus went crazy in the previous issue and beat the absolute snot out of Fitzroy and had to be pulled off him. So, you know, this is evidence that he's really on the edge in terms of everything that's happened to him in recent months. The suicide of his brother, the murder of his parents, his sister being deadly ill. And Professor X here is hopeful that they'll be home by dawn. And Storm replies, yes, it is to be hoped their return will calm Peter. He's highly agitated and concerned about his sister. The Professor knows it, as are we all, Aurora. As are we all. So nice little quiet panel here with Professor X down in the corner and you know, ruminating on what is inevitably coming. And here we've got these Dan Green pages. We've got 5 Dan Green pages in a row now. You can see very distinctive of him, his use of the brush. You can see the little brush hatch marks here on the blankets over Illyana. A very distinctive Dan Green ink making. So there's a moment of emergency as Illyana goes into a respiratory arrest. So Moira shoots her with adrenaline, and then Professor X goes to a treatment of last resort, which is to put this Shi'ar medical device on her head, which will put her into a kind of like a coma stasis, because she's at the point of death. And Moira here is protesting about it. There's no hope at all, Charles. You know full well this molecular cohesion unit will do nothing more than maintain her genetic integrity at its current state. I refuse to let you doom this child to a life in a coma. But the Professor says, and I, Moira, refuse to sit back and do nothing. And he's waiting, hoping for Forge to arrive, to link up with the Shi'ar tech that Professor X doesn't fully understand, and maybe find some way of doing something for Illyana that can reverse the deterioration wrought by the legacy virus. So while all of this is going on, and while Kitty here is saying, is also protesting about putting Kitty or Illyana into a coma, she says, Illyana was my best friend in the entire world. I'd do anything for her, and she'd do the same. That anything includes knowing when to hold on and when to let go. So, you know, there's division here in terms of what to do about Illyana's condition, whether to put her in this stasis, whether to let her die. And Jubilee sees the Banff doll, picks it up, dusts it off, and gives it to the comatose Illyana and says, I mean, if I couldn't do anything to make her better, I guess I was willing to settle for making her happy. Like I said, strange for me, as she walks away, almost in complete silhouette. Really well illustrated, and great storytelling here from this new artist, Richard Bennett. So we still have the Dan Green inks, and we have here Jubilee visiting later with some hot drinks for Kitty. Kitty's fallen asleep after telling Illyana's story, and Jubilee decides to pick up with the story. She just felt she couldn't be alone just then. I start reading where Kitty dozed off. Yeah, so it was in English. Big dup. It was the thought, she says. Taking the little girl in her arms, she flew up with her in brightness and joy, high so high, and there was no cold or hunger or sorrow, for she was with God. And then we do get a little footnote here from The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen. So, a story of tragedy and very fitting and foreboding in relation to Illyana's fate. And so she says to Ileana, I want to tell you things are going to be okay, but all I can do is be here for you. I hope that's enough. And then the night passes and she says to Jean in the present, I guess you know what happened then. And then we're back to Richard Bennett inking himself. Just aside from the story, this is a great shot of the Blackbird. A difficult one. He's setting himself like a challenge here to draw the undercarriage of the Blackbird. So the guy really talented with tech. And so we have the arrival then in the morning, having flown from Dallas of the Gold Team. Iceman's first out. Jubilee recalls Drake was ready to make with his lame-o humour when he snagged a clue. So they realise here with Kitty, Moira, Professor X and Jubilee that something's up, something's wrong. And Colossus arrives out of the Blackbird and Jubilee recalls, I don't think he even saw it coming. And he's angry here. While everyone is gathered here, who's looking after my sister, he asks. If I can't trust any of you to attend to her needs in my absence, then perhaps I should not leave her in your care. And all Professor X can say is, quietly, Peter, son, I'm sorry, we did everything we could. And he just doesn't respond. But you can see he's broken from his body language. Really nicely done by Bennett. And Jubilee, her commentary, the big guy didn't make a sound, no reaction at all. Didn't sob, didn't punch anybody. Didn't even turn around. But we can see on his face, like he's working through something there. And he's going to make a big decision very shortly in terms of his future with the X-Men. And then we're back in the present. Since I've been hanging out with you guys, Jubilee says, I got to mix it up with brood things, sentinels, acolytes and everything. So how is it you can save the world every morning pre-Wheaties, but when it comes to saving one little girl, zip. You ask me what I'm feeling, I feel like I just want to be left alone. So Jean embraces Jubilee and says, come here, Jubilee, we come into this world alone and we leave the same way. The time we spend in between, time spent alive, sharing, learning together, is all that makes life worth living. And Jubilee finally cries. So a big emotional wrap up to the issue. And as I said, like, interesting, the focus isn't on Ileana dying so much as it is on the character's reactions, and in particular the character who's closest in age to Ileana, Jubilee, and who herself as a young orphan has toughened up or made herself tough, but is finally venting her grief here. Grief for Ileana, and who knows if it isn't too much in the way of psychobabble, maybe grief for herself as a young orphan too, you know, sharing that with Ileana, that status. So there you go, the end of the issue. And one thing I want to say before I close the page is, you know, this is another one of Scott Lobdell's quiet issues. 297 was a classic of the form. This is another one. Very memorable to me, like 30 years later, this issue. And he was good at this stuff. And also he was very good with Jubilee writing her voice. It's tough for older writers sometimes to write dialogue for teenagers, and even though he wasn't very old, he was in his early to mid 20s when he was working on this, like, he captures her voice really well. It's not fake, it's not out of touch, it's well done. And also he understands her character as an orphan and works that well into the storytelling in this issue. So there's no letters page here. I do hope that you enjoyed this review of Uncanny X-Men 303. If you did, please like the video in YouTube, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more content like this.